Welcome, everyone. My name is Shiriel King-Abramson. I'm the Community Energy Resilience Specialist at the Climate Center, and I'm so glad to welcome you all here today for this webinar, Envisioning the Grid for the Future. This webinar is part of our webinar series on envisioning a climate-safe future for California, and we hope you will stay with us for future webinars as well, and we'll have information about that at the end. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we're going to get started. So I want to thank our sponsors to begin. Next slide. We are sponsored today by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Peninsula Clean Energy, River City Bank, MCE, Sunrun, and Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors for making this possible. We're also really grateful for our promotional partners, Actera, Act Now Bay Area, Clean Coalition, Civic Well, Climate Resolve, and Grid Alternatives and the Community Environmental Council. We are very passionate about working in partnership at the Climate Center, and we are grateful as well for our promotional partners. So I'm just going to give you now a brief overview of our webinar today. So the agenda to begin will be a quick presentation from me on Climate Safe California and what our campaign is about here at the Climate Center. Then we will hear from Jasmine Ansar, senior researcher with us here at the Climate Center, followed by Roger Lin, senior attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity, then Emmy Yoko Young, policy organizer for Reclaim Our Power, and finally Quinton G., manager of the Energy Assessments Division at the California Energy Commission. We will have a chance for you to ask questions at the end. So throughout the presentations, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. And we have staff working behind the scenes to make sure that we record your questions and we can direct them to the appropriate person during the Q&A. Finally, we will wrap up and have an action that all of you can take to support us with realizing this vision of our grid for the future. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Climate Center for those of you who are not familiar with our work. Our mission, next slide please, is to rapidly reduce climate pollution at scale starting in California. We believe in thriving, healthy communities, and we imagine and think it's very possible to create a future where everyone has clean air and water, renewable and reliable energy, and healthy food, thriving nature. And we work statewide with businesses, local governments, labor unions, and environmental justice leaders to work toward delivering these equitable climate solutions that the science demands of us. At the Climate Center, we believe that California must lead. As goes California, so goes the nation, and so goes the world sometimes. And we know that we have the tools and the know-how to lead, and all of us benefit when our elected officials take action. So we know that we need accelerated equitable solutions. We know that more than ever with the Los Angeles wildfires and the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and we know that we do have the leadership capability here in California. Our role at the Climate Center is to be a convener in making climate solutions a reality in California at speed and scale. We are a think tank, do tank, working to turn bold ideas into action. So we're interested in both creating the research, driving the policy, and also implementing that policy and carrying out projects to cover all aspects of this transition that we so badly need to a clean energy future. Next slide, please. So Climate Safe California is our flagship campaign to remove more climate pollution than we emit while securing resilience for our communities by 2030. And we have several aspects of our Climate Safe California campaign. We want to phase out fossil fuels from vehicles, from electricity systems, from our homes, and more. We want to be investing in resilient communities and clean energy systems, scale up carbon sequestration, and unlock public and private funding for climate action. Next slide, please. So the climate priorities that we have this year are to invest in decentralized clean energy. So we want to be incentivizing local clean energy solutions like rooftop solar and storage and microgrids for resilience, reliability, and jobs creation. We want to focus on rolling out bidirectional EV charging, enacting a mandate and regulations that ensure EV batteries can power our homes, businesses, and the electrical grid as we face more outages from growing climate extremes. We're interested in reforming our investor-owned utility system, changing the compensation structure for profit-making utilities so that our climate and communities benefit. And we also want to enact polluter pays laws in California following the lead of Vermont and New York. And finally, we have this roadmap for a managed transition away from fossil fuels. So we invite you, next slide please, to endorse Climate Safe California, and you can do so at the QR code there. So thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it over to Jasmine Ansar, our senior researcher at the Climate Center. Take it away, Jasmine.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and let me. I'm basically going to talk this morning about a new vision for the grid, one that delivers clean, reliable, resilient, and safe energy for California. Let me start just with the observation that California can use distributed energy resources to cost-effectively lower utility bills, rates, costs. And it would take some structural and regulatory reforms that I'll talk about. But let me just start by saying what I mean by distributed energy resources, or DERs, as everyone calls them. They're basically small-scale energy resources that generate, store, or consume energy. So you can think of rooftop solar, batteries, your car if it has bidirectional, if it's electric and it has bidirectional charging capabilities, and even energy efficiency. I think one thing to notice about this observation that makes it especially relevant and distressing is that we've actually faced an affordability crisis. That is, utility electric rates have skyrocketed, doubling in the last 10 years, and continuing to sharply increase, and are projected to continue to increase. 1 in 5 households are behind on their electric bills. This is especially hurtful to the low-income and disadvantaged communities because their utility bills are a much larger share of their income. In addition to affordability, there is a climate crisis, as we've all seen with the LA fires, and our hearts and prayers go out to them, and indeed even one of our colleagues. No one in California is really untouched. Extreme weather, such as wildfires or floods, create new stresses on the grid and for residents. We need to meet this challenge, and we need to address the root cause, and that's to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. And finally, the environmental justice crisis. And this really occurs because many polluting fossil fuel power plants lead to environmental harms. That is, they contaminate the air and the water. And many of the California peaker plants, which are typically fossil gas fired, are situated in disadvantaged communities. So let's talk a little bit about what are the characteristics of the grid of the future. And you have here just a very, very simple visual picture of it. You can see on the right-hand side the new vision. Here you have decentralized, diverse resources, you have flexible load, and you have resiliency, both in location and in type of resources. This contrasts with the left-hand side, which is the status quo, and if you like, the old world. It's centralized, it's top-down, they're large, centralized, usually transmission-connected, inflexible loads. That is, they have long ramp-up times to come online, and they're non-resilient because, of course, there's a single point of failure. The other thing to note with the new vision, if you like, is that there are substantial savings. And here, this is just one example. There was a Deloitte report recently which projects over $30 billion of cost savings, both in California and New York. That's through smart use of distributed energy resources. So there are various features of DERS, if I can call them that. I mean, one that is important is that it introduces demand flexibility, that it gives the ability to shape load to match supply. So you can reduce peak loads when supply is short and use and store power when supply is plentiful. And this, of course, lowers peak demand, which lowers costs. So, and secondly, I think another important feature is that DERs offer a cost-effective way of increasing non-polluting renewable energy supply. Just very briefly, here are some examples of DERs in action, if you will. There is Zoom, who have supplied bidirectional charging equipment to 74, 100% of the Oakland Unified School District school buses. This basically means that the schools actually can earn some money because they can supply vital grid balancing and other supplies, and of course it reduces fossil emissions. Another example is MCE's virtual power plant, where they have supplied low or no-cost energy efficiency and electrification equipment to low-income communities to save money, and they will receive credits on their energy bills. And in exchange, MCE can use and can aggregate this power and use it to form a virtual power plant. That is, they aggregate the loads and manage them so that they can act as if they're a single power plant. And finally, Haven Energy, which has provided solar and storage at zero cost to 300 low-income customers, and in return can, basically network their demands to supply, to create a virtual power plant. And as we saw with the electric school buses and the bidirectional chargers, of course, as mobile batteries via bidirectional electric vehicles can store and provide flexible power, whether it's, to your business, to your home, or to the grid. But this incredible flexibility makes them very valuable. Furthermore, the CEC estimates that by 2030 in California alone, there will be 8 million EVs. If these were bidirectional, they could store enough energy to power every home in California for a day. And just imagine scaling that up nationwide. You can see that, there are estimates showing that EV battery capacity will exceed US electric demands by 2035. I think another important factor in the shift to DERs is supported really by very compelling and changed economic trends. One is the plummeting costs of renewables, solar, battery, other renewables. Just to give you an example, battery costs have fallen an astounding 99% over the last 30 years, while their energy density has increased fivefold. In fact, costs have fallen so much that renewables are now they're now cheaper than fossil fuels, at least on a levelized cost basis. And this is, of course, in contrast to big wire transmission connected infrastructure and plants, where costs are increasing sharply, and not only costs, but also the regulatory hurdles, permitting, and all of that. This just illustrates the plummeting cost of solar photovoltaic modules. And this just indicates, too, the rising costs due to transmission and distribution spending. And I would just say that, nearly 50% of utilities and energy costs are costs used for the grid, used to deliver electricity. So if there are ways of avoiding it, which distributed energy resources can, then that's one of the things that makes them so cost effective. So how do we move from the status quo that is clearly not working to this new vision. We basically need some new policies. We need to reform grid resource planning and architecture so there's open access, so that it emphasizes local supply close to the load. And that should be kind of the starting point when supplying power. We should reform utility distribution utilities to provide an open access network. We need to compensate the full value of distributed energy resources, pay for the resilience value, the location value, the non-polluting value, and we need to reform utility compensation to align with state climate goals rather than incentivizing them to increase costs by just, giving them a return on capital expenditures. Here's just another infographic showing kind of and contrasting the new and the old world. I think the thing I would emphasize here is one of the things is that instead of power energy flowing from top to bottom, in this new world, basically consumers are much more active and actively participate in the market. So they are in effect prosumers, as some have called them. That is, they can actively manage their load, and you have bilateral energy trades and flowing. And let me just, I'm almost ended, just give you one final picture. This, I've talked about compensating for the full value of DERs. This is an example where you see there are different attributes given compensation. So locational value, the avoided demand from having to avoid to build new plant in the future, the environmental value, the non-polluting value, and of course, the value because it adds capacity at vital times such as system peaks, and the energy value. So actions for success. For policymakers, they need to dismantle regulatory roadblocks, which are hindering the deployment, and give them the ability to participate in an economically feasible and commercial way. Utilities need to invest in grid modernization to support bidirectional flows, and businesses need to develop strategies to leverage the emerging energy ecosystem. And more information on all of this, please go to our website where the full report is available and it contains more details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And feel free to check out the chat for a link to this report. We have lots more that you can read about on these topics in that report. So thank you again, Jasmine. I just want to remind all of our speakers today to please explain any acronyms that you use as well. I know we're in an energy landscape swimming with acronyms, and we have folks on the webinar here with all levels of prior experience and familiarity with these topics, and we're really grateful that all of you are here today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Roger Lynn. He is the senior attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the time, and big thanks to the Climate Center for putting on this event. I think I have my slide deck that's going to pop up in a second. Yeah. So again, I'm with the Center for Biological Diversity's Energy Justice Program, and where we are guided by the mantra that is on the screen right now, that it's not enough that our energy future be technologically clean and renewable, it must also be just. And this presentation is going to run through some elements of what that requires. Next slide, please. Echoing Dr. Ansar's prior presentation, here's another image of the old grid with the new grid. And then just emphasizing again the decentralized nature of the new grid, and also looking at the arrows going both ways. But again, we need to embed justice in this new grid as well. And next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Some essential aspects of the grid. First, this image from the California Environmental Justice Alliance. We have to prioritize environmental justice. We cannot leave communities behind again, as we have done with our current energy system or the old energy system. To do that, we need to ensure that non-energy benefits, that an image from the Local Clean Energy Alliance here, shows determine energy resource selection. This presentation will dive in further to what those benefits are. And third, we need to end reliance on fossil fuels and false solutions. And fourth, to get there, we need less reliance on the investor-owned utilities and the bulk grid. Next slide, please. So first, justice. The image here to the right is from Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Dr. Ansar mentioned that energy burden is highest in environmental justice communities, but where energy is also rooted in so many different community needs, whether it's food distribution, water conservation, access to the internet, transportation, education through youth programs, and overall public health. But energy is more than just keeping the lights on. It is firmly rooted in all of these community needs. But we also need to get rid of disproportionate impacts of pollution that are predominantly in environmental justice communities, and also ensure that there is an adequate distribution of benefits of the energy system that I'll get to next. And finally, just have to emphasize the benefits of local ownership. I've put in here a report, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, talking about all of the benefits of ownership of local energy, not just citing local energy, but having more benefits there, more jobs, bill savings, local wealth creation, energy democracy, community-driven decision-making, which adds to community political power. Next slide, please. The reason for all of these disproportionate impacts, though, is because of our current failure to consider non-energy benefits, which are basically public health and environmental consequences of our energy decisions. Factors like local air quality, water quality and quantity, resilience, local economic development. You would think that as a state, we would be considering these factors when we decide which energy resources to prioritize and procure, but our top-down planning investment decision framework does not consider these factors, and so therefore cannot meet today's urgent needs. One of them being what this slide from the Local Clean Energy Alliance shows, resilience hubs. We would have a lot more of these if we considered non-energy benefits in decision-making. Next slide, please. Another example from the California Environmental Justice Alliance, the Solar or Multifamily Homes Program. You'll see incredible workforce development benefits, local air, climate benefits, and also access to tribes. Next slide, please. The program is growing. We need to do more there, but also want to note the affordability aspect, that there are tremendous bill savings for participants as well. But we do need to get more of these programs out there in California. Next slide, please. And there is tremendous opportunity for distributed resources to also shut down dirty power plants. We have to address false solutions in doing so. You can have a power plant with hydrogen and carbon capture on top, and that is fine by the state to meet our clean energy goals. So unless we consider these local impacts of these false solutions and of power plants, we'll keep going with the status quo. And again, distributed resources have enormous potential to get rid of the power plants. Rooftop solar, as the chart here shows, since at least 2006 has kept peak electricity demand flat. Couple that with electric vehicles, batteries on wheels, we'll be able to do even more. And then energy efficiency as well, we can't forget about that. The 2012 local government portfolios for the regional energy network providers could have gotten rid, or were able to get rid of at least 2 large power plants. So there are incredible benefits of distributed resources to clean up our grid. Next slide, please. In addition to the environmental biodiversity and impacts to species of big transmission build-outs and big utility scale infrastructure build-outs as well, the recent Los Angeles fires have unfortunately shown the need for resilience. Less dependence on the bulk grid also helps affordability and energy democracy. And we may not need that much more transmission in California anyway. This chart is from the United States Department of Energy from 2023, which shows that we only need 1% more of transmission build out compared to 2020. Next slide, please. To get there, though, we have to take advantage of the built environment. This top quote from Bill Powers at the Protect Our Communities Foundation shows that in San Diego gas and electric territory, there's enough rooftops and parking lot potential to fill the energy gap to be able to fully decarbonize by 2045. And NREL, in the second quotes, reaches a similar conclusion, looking only at small, medium, and large buildings. California can meet 74% of the need for electricity. Next slide, please. And this is from a report from us pursuing a just and renewable energy system. If we do need additional bulk infrastructure, then we need to look at what these other areas like canals, existing rights of way, degraded lands, other industries. And you could see that in 2020, we were able to meet all of our energy needs from 2022. This is a national report. So on a national level, we could meet all of our energy needs again by taking advantage of the built environment and degraded lands. Next slide, please. So the local vision for this, imagine a school with solar panels on top of it. It has a power purchase agreement with the local community choice aggregator, can sell power to the grid or to others in that respect, provide excess electricity to neighbors. It's coupled with an electric school bus with bidirectional capability, charging from local PV generation. And it is still connected with the bulk grid, but as a microgrid. So it has the ability to island during outages. Next slide, please. And finally, just want to end with some recommendations. First, movement building. Again, thank you for putting this on today. We need to take this show on the road and have education to school districts, local elected officials, city planners, keep the dialogue going amongst ourselves and other nonprofit allies and identify other folks. We need to increase local capacity for energy planning with an eye towards strengthening the local economy, planning at the community level with under a local supply first principle. That way we won't overbuild the grid. We'll just serve local needs and priorities. To get there, though, we need regulatory reform. Echoing the prior presentations, recommendations with these first two, we have to allow distributed resources to use existing wires at a fair rate and provide compensation for the energy to transact and use and grid services. We need to recognize public health and environmental benefits of resources, and we need to compare those with other resources in a bottom-up resource planning process. And we also have to address regulatory barriers, remove transmission access charges. If we're not using the transmission system, we're only at the distribution level. Why should there be fees there? And then also there's this power charge and difference adjustment fee that's currently charged to community choice aggregators, subscribers, and for exiting the grid when you don't really exit the grid. So it's an arcane concept that we need to fix as well. And last but not least, we need to protect programs like the multifamily homes program, solar multifamily homes, energy efficiency, where we've seen those successes. We need to protect those from being cut, which is unfortunately happening this year. And we need to, again, I'll end with saying we have to keep the dialogue going and keep the movement going and tell folks and have more webinars and activities like these. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Roger. It is now my pleasure to introduce Emmy Yoko Young, Policy Organizer with Reclaim Our Power.
Great. Thank you so much for the Climate Center for having me here today. Let me just grab my screens and get them all set. Okay. So again, my name is Emiyoko Young. I'm the policy organizer with the Reclaim Our Power Utility Justice Campaign and based here in Oakland, California on Lijon Ohlone land. So I really appreciate that this webinar is all about visioning for a future we want to see. Reclaim Our Power recently had an in-person gathering, and we started our time together visioning and imagining what a justice-centered utility could look like. We went around the room building on each other's vision, and as each person took a turn, we could see more vividly the grid of the future we're building together. And this brought a lot of hope, especially as we're navigating through so many crises. And our visions and our imaginations help create a pathway for how we break free. Writer Adrienne Marie Brown talks about how we so often are in an imagination battle. Other people's imaginations have created our current conditions, polluting power plants, prisons, red line neighborhoods. And as organizers, we're often needing to react to the inhumane conditions created by other people's imaginations. But we also need to reclaim our time and energy to imagine the long-term change we need and we want to see. And that's what we're here to do today. And as you can see from Ollie Costello's art, it portrays our imaginations will transform our world. So what is the grid of the future? Reclaim Our Power, like others have said before me, envisions a future where we have a safe, reliable, affordable, local, sustainable, and decentralized energy system. We believe this future is possible, but we also believe that we won't be able to get there and move towards this vision as long as the investor-owned utility system is in place. Our work as a coalition is to build a not-for-profit utility to replace investor-owned utilities like PG&E. It is a pretty big vision, but as many abolitionists have said before me, we can't actualize what we can't visualize. Reclaim Our Power Utility Justice Campaign is a coalition of 90 organizations from fire-impacted communities in the North Bay, facing constant power shutoffs in the name of safety, to people with disabilities who require power to live in Oakland, to those of us across the state who can barely afford to pay our electric bills. Reclaim Our Power stands to center our lives and communities in the decision-making that otherwise happens behind closed doors. And we believe that we deserve a justice-centered utility, one that will not replicate the harms of PG&E. We need to prioritize a better utility system because we know the needed changes won't ever happen with PG&E and the other investor-owned utilities running our energy system. The harms of the IOU, PG&E specifically, are constant and endless, but I'll name just a few because some of them have been named already. With wildfires, since 2017, PG&E is responsible for causing more than 30 wildfires that have destroyed more than 23,000 homes and businesses and killed over 100 people. It's well documented that PG&E slashed its maintenance budget for decades in order to pay out multi-million-dollar bonuses. Rates. Just last year, PG&E's rates became the highest in California, which is the second highest electric rates in the nation. In 2024 alone, PG&E increased rates by 13%. Utility shutoffs. As a result of rising rates, people can't afford their bills, and 1 in 5 households in PG&E service territory are in utility debt. Disconnection rates for non-payment are especially high in zip codes with higher percentages of Black, Latina, and people with disabilities. And attacks on our grid for the future. PG&E and the other investor-owned utilities successfully got the CPUC to gut residential solar incentives, net energy metering, that reduced the amount of solar owners receive for producing excess power by at least 75%. This resulted in an 82% reduction in demand for solar installations in 2023 and the loss of 17,000 solar installer jobs. What's important to walk away with is that PG&E isn't just one bad apple. We're seeing similar problems with other IOUs in California and across the country. The problem is the for-profit investor-owned utility model itself. This is why Reclaim Our Power wants to replace IOUs with a people-centered utility that doesn't make its decision based on maximizing profits. But we also know that when we build a new utility, it's not enough to just take the profit motive out of the utilities. We must build a new utility with justice at the center. And how we make this transition to a new utility matters. We have 10 principles, which you can see here on this slide. that guides how we move towards a justice-centered energy system. We need our frontline community solutions and experiences to be front and centered of any future utility that would replace PG&E. So here are some solutions, which some have been named, but others that we have been coming up with as a campaign. So thinking about utility infrastructure, we want a utility that builds, maintains, and repairs infrastructure when it's needed for safety, inclusion, and resilience. We don't want a utility that is incentivized to build unnecessary infrastructure because it will result in profits. In fire-impacted communities, we can build back more resilience by investing in distributed energy resources, local rooftop solar, energy efficiency, and conservation. Our new utility can invest in islandable microgrids powered by solar, wind, and backed up with batteries, possibly eliminating risky transmission through remote areas more likely to be impacted by disasters. We can have a utility that is going to prioritize maintenance, more regular inspection, and equipment audits for safer systems. This might also prevent more public safety power shutoffs. We want a utility that is going to be accountable for past harms and take action to repair. This would mean making fire-impacted survivors financially whole by amending the Wildfire Fund, AB 1054, to allow all wildfire victims to access funds, eliminate the ratepayer contributions to the fund, and instead require shareholders to pay 100% of costs moving forward. This doesn't have to wait for a new utility. This could actually happen now. We want land back to California Native tribes and tribal nations. Through its land conservation commitments, PG&E retains ownership of 140,000 acres of watershed land, which could be returned to Indigenous communities. We want to minimize future harms to people and ecologies through land use decisions. And as already named, we want to equitably decommission gas infrastructure and transition towards electrification. We want to prioritize decommissioning gas plants in environmental justice communities and replace with community-owned solar without unduly burdening ratepayers. We want a utility that has transparency in their finances and isn't constantly placing the burdens on customers by raising rates. We want to eliminate energy burden and eliminate shutoffs for inability to pay. We want participatory budgeting and rate design. We want on-bill financing, enabling energy saving upgrades to be paid off by customers over time to spread out the cost and ultimately result in lower bills. We want a utility that practices energy democracy and is accountable, practicing participatory governance instead of making decisions that benefit shareholder interests. We also want a local economic development and a utility that believes in local resilience and promotes rooftop solar. This includes clean energy job creation and green job training programs, development of community-owned solar and storage microgrids for shared wealth building, the transfer of union pensions and improved benefits and conditions for unionized workers, and recirculating energy costs for other local community priorities. These are just the beginning of the solutions we've envisioned, and we're inviting others to continue building more with us. So we are dreaming big with our vision, and we are dreaming what our communities need and deserve. All the technology exists today to carry out our vision for local, resilient, decentralized, community-owned and controlled, renewable energy utility system. The reason we don't have this now is because our people-powered solutions do not provide profits for investor-owned utilities. So it's going to take building people power to overcome the political obstacles to do this. So how do we get there? We co-design a new not-for-profit utility with frontline communities. Before we can replace the IOU, we have to build what we will replace it with. We implement a new utility, studying and creating a transition plan to the successor utility. And we want to revoke PG&E's business license, transfer their assets, and establish a new not-for-profit utility. And when we've won, we will have the grid we deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emmy. Next, we're going to hear from Quentin G., who is the manager of the Energy Assessments Division at the California Energy Commission.
Great. Thanks, Shariel. Thanks, everybody. Hi, my name is Quentin G. I'm a manager in the Energy Assessments Division at the California Energy Commission. So just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities for EVs to help reduce the costs of electricity. And I'll sort of start off with kind of pointing out like what we do at the commission. We sort of conduct analysis, and one of our big products is our forecast. The forecast involves a lot of energy sources and a lot of energy sources of demand. We sort of model the entire economy. But one big thing that we do is we do focus on zero emission vehicles and the transportation forecasts that we do. And so here you can see what we're looking at is zero emission vehicles, what we call ZEVs. Roughly stated, these are EVs. So maybe I'll try to stick to EVs, but pardon my use of ZEV if that happens. But by 2040, we're based off of policies such as the Advanced Clean Car Regulation. We're expecting the light duty vehicles in the state to represent 63% of all the registered vehicles in the state. When we look at the actual miles driven, because newer cars tend to be driven more than older cars, actually the miles, the EV miles or ZEV miles that we would see are expected to represent about 77% of the miles. So we are approaching a zero emission future when it comes to transportation. And yeah, there's a lot going on here behind our modeling efforts, but this is kind of the big picture takeaway. What does that mean overall for electricity? I mean, these are primarily going to be electric vehicles, especially in the light duty sector. When we take a look at the fact that we already consume a lot of electricity overall, in the state, we expect demand to grow. We have recently integrated in data centers and lots of other sources of demand. People use air conditioners, light bulbs, TVs, all kinds of things demand electricity. By the time we get to that 2040 time period, we're looking at about 23% of the electricity, the total amount of electricity that we need would be expected to be used for electric vehicles. That will grow past 2040 as well, but just sort of looking at our standard forecast, that's what we're looking at overall. So then the question is, and maybe one thing I should acknowledge here is, even though it's 23% of the kind of the load, that is an upper bound estimate because a lot of people, and as some of the folks have mentioned here, they kind of envision a lot more rooftop PV, local PV, those sorts of things. Photovoltaic systems, solar systems. If that happens, this is actually an upper bound because people might be self-generating their own electricity to charge vehicles as well. So this is an upper estimate of the EV impact compared to all the load that needs to be served by investor-owned utilities. So with that, I mean, you can see the growth. I mean, there's a lot of growth here, electric vehicles, and then on top of that, lots of other demand as well, population growth, et cetera. We're going to use a lot more electricity in the future. That means that we're going to need a lot more resources for that. That means sort of roughly stated, we're going to be looking at more generation to meet that load, more transmission, lots more wires, et cetera, distribution. So things like substations, transformers, all kinds of electrical equipment that you see when you're driving, along the highway and you see all these wires. That's going to require more money to build out to meet that demand that we expect to see growing in the near future. So we will have to invest more money. The question is how much money, right? And this is one of the things that sort of is in the broader phase, but I just kind of want to set a little bit of a stage here with a thought experiment here to think about costs. So imagine you operate a factory, it costs $100,000 a day to operate, and you want to expand, and now it's going to cost you $110,000 a day to operate. And you say, okay, my costs have gone up by 10%. That's true, right? But let's also imagine that daily output increases by 20%, right? So in this situation, what we call the marginal cost, the per unit, whatever it is you're producing in that factory, the per unit cost goes down. You're spending more money, but you're producing much more stuff. Not that we necessarily want to consume just stuff for its own sake, but just theoretically speaking, the costs can go down in this situation. And so in this, so just to sort of folks to simmer on, what I want folks to think about here is to just recognize that an increase in costs can mean a lower cost per unit of output. Okay, so now let's put this back into the grid context here, and to sort of provide a simple sort of way of thinking about this. Here's kind of the 24-hour load that we can imagine over the course of a typical summer day. You can see here, 4 to 8 p.m. people are really using a lot of electricity, primarily because of air conditioners. And sort of roughly stated, when we have to build out the grid, all that sort of infrastructure that we're thinking about, we have to build to this level at the very least. However, what that also means is all those wires are kind of resting, or at least not using their full capacity during these other times of the day and other times of the season as well. And so that's an opportunity. If we invest to that top amount, but we are not using all this other area, if we use that, we may not have to invest for the additional energy that we consume during that time, those other times of the day and times of the season. So let's think about this in perspective when it comes to electric vehicle load. You can sort of look at, like, here I've sort of broken it out now. We can imagine all the other load and then sort of break it into the light duty electric vehicles here. So you can sort of see that in one way of thinking about it, electric vehicles, everyone plugs in at 5 p.m. and turns on their air conditioner, right? That could mean you have to build out a lot more to satisfy that demand. But with smart policies and other integration, some people, of course, will need to charge at 5 p.m. There's all kinds of different needs that people have when we've got 40 million, plus people in a state. But things like time of use rates, managed charging, workplace charging incentives, programs, those sorts of things could encourage us to reduce that load at that critical time, and also, but charge the same amount, but use it in that time when there's plenty of excess capacity. So the concept here is with the downward pressure potential is you may initially think more electricity, more grid expansion costs. That's true to a certain degree, but another way to think of it is EVs, let's say, represent about 23% of the electricity demand in 2040. But if they only contribute at that peak level, that area that we really need to focus on for planning, if they only contribute 13% to that peak, we now have a 13% sort of additional expansion, but we're going to sell 23% more kilowatt hours or units of energy. And so the idea is that you do have to expand the grid to a certain amount, but you're doing it with by selling more electricity than you would expect with that expansion, than you would normally expect with that expansion. And so the idea is that grid upgrade costs could be spread over more kilowatt hours of electricity and could mean lower costs to all ratepayers. That's the potential that we're thinking about here. Now, I should acknowledge that this doesn't mean that rates will always go down. As we've seen in some of the other presentations earlier today, there are a host of other situations and challenges that we have with a climate risk future that we're looking at. So there's lots of other costs, undergrounding, other mitigation efforts, or there may be some other things that we have to think about with rate increases as well. But the opportunity is that the electric vehicles may serve as a downward pressure sort of potential. We'll also be able to post the slides here. I realize I'm running a little short on time. Let me kind of move quickly, but there are a couple reports that some people may have heard of. There's 2 reports in particular that kind of present differing views on this. There is a report in 2023 by an organization known as Kavala. They estimated upwards of $50 billion to build the grid out to 2035, with electric vehicles being a major source contributor to that. That was not using our sort of framework for thinking about electricity load and the time of use rates and other kinds of things like that. There was another report by the Public Utilities Commission, Public Advocate's Office, that actually did think through the downward pressure potential in that area as well. And they thought maybe up to $26 billion of additional investment, but then also potentially by selling more kilowatt hours in that excess capacity that you have at other times of the day, you could actually result in maybe a savings on the order of 1 to 2, maybe 1 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour of demand reduction or downward pressure on your rates. And they're continuing to work on those studies as well. One final point that I just kind of wanted to put out there as another opportunity, people talked about bidirectionality. I'll just quickly run through this and folks can take a closer look if they want to later. But sort of looking at that original slide that I showed, that slide that I showed with the kind of the reduction from pricing incentives, it's also possible that if people use their cars as a battery and run their power off at other times, they might be able to kind of buy low, what we call arbitrage, buy low, and then not sell to anyone else high necessarily, but you might sell to yourself high. So if a lot of people treat their EV as a battery in the future, you could actually flatten that curve even a bit more. So in any case, happy to discuss this further and looking forward to the conversation here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Quentin. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we will be asking the questions that you all have put in the Q&A function on Zoom, and feel free to keep putting your questions there and we will get those sorted and directed to our panelists. Quentin, thank you so much again. I'll invite all of our panelists back on Zoom now for video. And I'm going to start with actually a question for Quentin. We have a question: with EVs consuming 40% of residential electric load, how is it that we can get the distribution and transmission grid to require no substantial change? The peaks will move and will be longer.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're not expecting EVs to be that high by 2040. Maybe by 2050, we could see numbers around 40% of the demand. We do forecasting, we plan that out, we kind of know it's coming. And so utilities, be they public or investor-owned utilities or however, whatever framework you want to see it, would have that information, and it's their responsibility to plan for that in a cost-effective way. I think that the opportunity is there. Like I mentioned, if you kind of treat your home or your car as a battery, that can be very helpful as well. But yeah, the opportunity is that there will be, the point is that there will be some costs. There will be some upgrades that are necessary. But the hope is that, if you only upgrade a little bit, but you're consuming a lot more at other times of the day and you don't have to absorb the full upgrade cost, you could actually have a reduction in pressure. If everybody wants to plug in at 5 p.m., run their AC, turn their electric dryer on, and start cooking on an induction stove, then you can start to see problems. But the hope is that we can develop smart policies. People don't need to do this. Electric vehicles are very, very flexible. Not always, but generally speaking, most people could charge in a very managed way, and we could reduce costs for folks overall, or at least put downward pressure on their rates.
Thank you, Quentin. Next, we have a question for Roger, and others are welcome to answer as well. How realistic are mini grids, local community grids, or even neighborhood grids? We're talking about very small microgrids here.
I think on the regulatory standpoint, we unfortunately see a lot of issues with interconnection. So feasibility as far as like actually getting it done, I think it's feasible, and going back to, it's not quite a mini grid, sorry, but a comparable, I think, example is the resilience hub that is in Richmond, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and other allies really got going. It's ready to go. Whether it's interconnected by PG&E to the distribution system is a different question. So we do need regulatory reform to make mini grids, microgrids more feasible for sure. Yes.
If others want to jump in, feel free as well.
And also just going back to the feasibility as well, I think the recommendations from Dr. Ansar and my presentation about like enabling local transactions, you know, allowing distributed resources to use the utility wires, like those sorts of reforms are the ones we're talking about to just make them even more feasible.
Thank you, Roger. We have a question for Jasmine on her presentation. What is meant by levelized cost basis?
Levelized cost just compares the cost of electric production produced by different technologies. It basically measures the average cost of producing electricity over the lifetime of a power plant. So it's kind of a bit of a nerdy concept. And there are many calculators which will give it to you, but I think the simplest way is just different technologies have different lifetimes. And so you have to, take that into account when you're considering the investment and return of those assets.
Well, thank you for that technical explanation, Jasmine. Another question here for you, Jasmine. What does it mean to modernize our grid to support bidirectional energy flow? This already happens with residential solar. What more do we need for this?
Well, I think partly what Roger sort of said previously was of relevance here, because in order to enable it, you need to basically compensate or provide adequate compensation for it. And that most certainly does not happen at the moment. So there are significant, as I said, there are both regulatory and structural reforms needed in order to enable it to be commercially viable. So I think that's an important barrier and hurdle. I don't know, Roger probably has other things he can add, maybe.
No, definitely. Just the compensation aspect is critical. Yes. Yeah. Things have to pencil out for folks. Yeah, it's at the end of the day, that's why. And I see some questions regarding like our positions on net metering and everything, and it's that's one way to look at value. But I think the model of compensation that we're discussing today is different in actual energy transactions.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. We have a question for Emmy here. What is the role of the Public Utilities Commission in finding and implementing policies and influencing the utility strategies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And maybe Roger can tap in after me as well. The CPUC can impose policies on the utilities, and they have to approve rate increases based on budgetary budgets presented by the IOUs. But the CPUC is a regulatory agency, which means that the work that they do is by design reactive rather than proactive towards the things that we need to see. So in theory, the CPUC has a lot of power to make change. But we also see that there are, several issues that come into play with the IOUs. One I think is that the IOUs are really incentivized to maximize their profits. So they create conditions where the IOUs will say or do whatever it needs to demonstrate that they've met the criteria that are set by the CPUC, and will always try to game the system in that way. And second, like looking at the track record of the CPUC, we've seen like through articles by Loretta Lynch, who was a former president of the CPUC, that they haven't done a good job holding the IOUs accountable. There's this book by Catherine Blunt called California Burning that outlines the decades of corruption, the revolving door politics. And, Newsom is the one who appoints the commissioners. And so he's gotten a lot of money from the IOUs over the decades. And so, we see that is a problem. And so, while their job is to regulate, in our experience, we haven't seen that be as effective as needed.
Thank you, Emmy. Did anyone else want to add on to that?
I'll just add that I do think, I totally agree with what Emmy was saying, that utility compensation reform is desperately needed. I mean, at the moment, the way that they're regulated and the way that they increase their rates, it's based on how much they spend. We really need to change that round, and they should be given incentives to be paid for how much they save. And that's just a fundamental kind of rethink, if you will, of that model.
Thank you, Jasmine. Shifting the conversation back a little bit more toward our projected EV population and load, we've got a question for Quentin. With vehicle-to-grid technology, could EVs represent a negative contribution to peak load in 2040 instead of the projected positive 13%?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think um, it it could very much in theory. If you take a look at the number of vehicles that we expect, electric vehicles in 2040, even if you were to say, only half of those can actually do that, and then only half of those are not plugged in or are plugged in and have the tech, you kind of, even if you slice it down, I mean, if you're looking at, 20 million electric vehicles, let's say, and 2 million of those could contribute 10 kilowatts, let's say. That's a common vehicle to grid potential out there. Simply, I mean, that is, I think that's 20 gigawatts of power. I mean, and at peak we're at maybe 50, 60 gigawatts. So I mean, just a small slice of cars could really contribute a whole amount there. Now, the programmatic, how to make that effective, how to make that cost effective, how to make sure that there's geographical considerations taken into account, because you don't necessarily want 10 neighbors all in a line to start all funneling power in at the exact same time. That could cause problems for their transformer that's serving all of those homes. So there are some challenges there, but in theory it's very much possible, and definitely an opportunity, and we want to keep an eye on those opportunities as they arise. The fundamentals are there though, and it could be a net negative on the grid.
Awesome. Thank you, Quentin. We have a question for Roger. How can citizens accelerate favorable regulation, for example, interconnection?
I always say about anything, like, and as an attorney, this is especially important because it's something like, it's everything is a movement, like what we're doing right now. And even like I see acronyms like DERs or DERs or distributed resources, it's just popularizing a lot of these ideas. And I think just sharing these ideas with friends and just making sure that, I feel like one of the biggest barriers in our world, in the energy world, is all these complicated terms for actually relatively simple things. But we like to overcomplicate things. So again, like stuff, the Climate Center putting on things like this workshop, and for an opportunity for us to share this information, like please also share it with others, and get involved with the legislatures, local decision making, get your local electeds excited about the opportunity. If you know folks in schools, talk to the school district. Hey, would you like to be a microgrid? And there is a good coalition of schools trying to get solar right now as well. So and it really is just popularizing this. This is a movement, whether we realize this or not. And we just have to keep the dialogue going.
Thank you, Roger. On the note of movement building, I have a question for Emmy here. We have someone in the audience who is interested in the engagement of CCAs, cities, and counties, if any, in the golden energy nonprofit utility concept, and if there has ever been any statewide polling done on this. Also, this person is interested in knowing if the coalition envisages a legislative approach or a ballot initiative, and what is the aspirational timing on this?
Thank you for that question. And so kind of just to go back to what Golden State Energy is. So a new utility actually exists on paper, and after PG&E's second bankruptcy in less than 20 years, SB 350 was passed in 2020. And it was really to create a new utility, a plan B, if PG&E were to fail. And the way that that would have been enacted was through a 6-step accountability process that would be determined by the CPUC, that said, like, if PG&E were to, fail in these regards, that this new utility would come into place. But since that was passed, we haven't seen any investment in to what Golden State Energy could be. And so what is happening on the state level, we've actually been passing resolutions in different cities to really show that there's a movement of cities that want to see something different. The city of San Francisco passed something a few years ago. The city of Richmond did. We're working with another city in the Bay Area that is going to be presenting a resolution in February. We've talked to a small city in the Fresno County, and so there's a lot of energy around this. And I think to the point around CCAs, we haven't directly engaged with CCAs in this way of like organizing, but we have been hearing a lot more about how they've experienced a lot of challenges working with PG&E. PG&E tried to dismantle CCAs several years ago, so that already like creates some challenges there, just around what that working relationship would look like. And so we do hope that whatever new utility would come into place would have a better relationship. And I think to this question around a legislative approach or a ballot initiative, like we do want to see the state put investment in what a new utility could look like, whether it is studying what this new utility could be and to build that out and to create an implementation plan and to really do the work that it'll take to like move this forward. And so we would love to see a bill move forward to invest those resources into building out what a new utility could be. And I think a ballot initiative is a good question because if the state isn't willing to move that forward, if our legislatures who like so many legislators have received a lot of money from the IOUs aren't willing to stand up against the IOUs, then we do have to take it to our people, and a ballot initiative is the way that would happen.
Thank you, Emmy. We have another question for Quentin on the more technical side here. Sodium batteries are cheaper but heavier. Not practical for EVs, but would they be practical for homes? Is anyone working on that, and how could that improve the situation?
Yeah, so sodium batteries are an opportunity. There's lots of different battery chemistry technologies out there. Sodium batteries probably aren't going to be ideal for people that need the kind of range out there, but yeah, I mean, we're continuing always looking at that. That's a little bit outside of my area, but we have an energy research and development division at the Energy Commission that does a lot of sort of research and development, funds development of these things. So there are opportunities there. Sodium batteries, I would say, are probably not, there may be a pathway for them in transportation. There's also what are called lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are they're kind of in between the sodium and the standard lithium ion batteries. So there are lots of opportunities there. And yeah, the vehicle weight is a challenge. But we're finding that, as we continue to keep tabs on what's happening in the market, we are finding that it does appear that batteries are getting lighter. And lighter could mean, less road wear, tire wear, maybe longer ranges if people really want it. To the point where maybe even in the medium and heavy duty sector, some of our calculations have shown that it's possible actually for an electric truck, a big rig, Class 8, big, huge thing. If batteries can double in their energy density or what we call specific energy, but kind of the amount of battery per unit weight, right? If you can double that capacity there, they would actually be lighter and would be able to carry more than a typical truck, because those big standard trucks, they have big, huge, heavy engines, huge transmissions and gearboxes and all those kinds of things, which can be eliminated in electric vehicles. Right now, the batteries are too heavy, but there are opportunities, but not so sure about sodium just yet.
Thank you, Quentin. And I just want to take a moment to say that all of these presentations and our report as well as the recording of this webinar will be sent to everybody who registered for the webinar afterwards. So I know we have a question about that in the chat, and you will all be getting that afterward. Back to our content questions. We have a question here for Emmy and Roger. Are you hearing about any examples of low-income people getting strapped with higher energy bills when they install electric appliances in IOU territory?
You gonna go, Emmy? Should I go?
Oh, I saw you unmute, so I'll let you go first, Roger, and I can follow.
So in 2018 or so, the Public Utilities Commission authorized community solar pilot projects in the San Joaquin Valley, basically giving folks electric appliances and examining this issue. Like, there was a bill protections mechanism, or a bill savings mechanism actually also imposed, which was a 20% reduction on bills. To make sure that this, what you're talking about, like electrifying, wouldn't create these price shocks for folks. The evaluation on those pilots on this bill savings question came out a couple months ago, and concluded that the bill savings mechanism worked, and folks had what and was actually protection from the rate increases that we've seen. So it wasn't so much electrification increasing energy bills. You also have to factor what the electricity is displacing. And in this case, in the San Joaquin Valley, it was propane, expensive propane, or very unhealthy wood burning. And then there's another question of how do you factor in the non-energy benefits that we talked about, like public health, that and everything as well. But either way, the bill savings mechanism created a protection from the rate increases that we've seen all over California, but the rate increases were not from the electrification itself.
Yeah, I can say like from folks who have been like giving public testimony or folks we've been in relationship with, the focus hasn't necessarily been on the transition to electrification, just the focus is on the 13% rate hikes. And a lot of that has impacted, folks really, really significantly. We're hearing people talk about just like the hard choices that they have to make. Somebody in our coalition constantly talks about having to choose between purchasing insulin or paying their electric bills. But then if you purchase the insulin, then you don't have a refrigeration to actually put your medication in a safe and in the environment that it needs. And so I think it's less about like the focus on the transition from gas to electric and the electric appliances and just more around rates are really, really high. People can't afford it. They don't know how to plan for the future because these rate hikes are consistent. Like we had 6 rate hikes just in 2024 alone. And like if you don't know like when a rate hike is going to happen, then it's hard to really prepare for the future. And so I would just say bottom line is that the rate hikes are a problem, but we haven't heard the blame being towards electrification.
Thank you, Emmy, and thank you, Roger. Question for Jasmine. Can you talk more about the creation of the Grid for the Future report? Tell us more about why this report is important now more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the report is important because it really brings the concept, hopefully in a way that it will explain it, if you like, for everyone. And it really shows and brings to light, I think, facts and a framework in which everyone can see and understand some of the costs and benefits, if you will, of not making this transition. We are, as I said in the presentation, we are in the status quo. We're facing all these crises, and really what the vision does is it tries to lay a pathway for how we can emerge from these crises and how we can meet these challenges.
And just want to jump in as well and just throw out that at the Energy Commission's kickoff workshop for the non-energy benefits proceeding that they're doing last year, there were there's a community voices panel, and Mayor Ray Leon from Huron had a great term that we're in an energy rush right now. So we're at this transition period, not transition period, but there's this opportunity right now where do we keep doing the same thing that we've been doing, or do we switch to a vision that has more community and environmental benefits? So it's whether we're talking about more data centers out there, whether we even need them, or like the electrification or the EVs opportunities that Quinton discussed. It's like we're at this key time right now to be making these decisions.
Thank you, Roger. And speaking of being at a key time, we have a question in the chat about how the goals of the new federal administration are going to be affecting our efforts here in California to bring about this grid for the future. This is a question for any of you to answer if you have thoughts about any ways in which our new Trump administration will be affecting our efforts here.
When it comes to our forecast, I think I showed folks there's the light duty, and then there's the medium and heavy duty sort of representing a certain slice of the electricity demand. That is based off of the medium and heavy duty part is based off of the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which is what the California Air Resources Board had adopted, but they did rescind their waiver request from the Environmental Protection Agency. So they can't have that. They can't implement that regulation without EPA approval, and so they pulled back that request prior to the new administration coming in. That will impact our freight forecast and the medium and heavy duty component there. But overall, I would say that there's a really, it's regardless of what you might see happen at a federal level, there is this kind of the economics, I think, of it can be quite compelling when done in an effective way. And so, it's possible that regulatory, challenges that we as a state may face, it's possible those could have an impact. But, from what we understand, the way that consumers understand electric vehicles, just generally the costs, the price, the declines that we're expecting in vehicle prices, we think that there's still going to be a strong electric vehicle future for us. And I don't know if there's really much that can be done when people want these vehicles.
Yeah, thank you, Quentin. Feel free to jump in, Jasmine.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm just adding support really to what Quentin said, but I think the economics ultimately will win out the day. I mean, bottom line, renewables are simply getting cheaper and cheaper, and fossil fuels are getting more and more expensive in many different ways, both in terms of energy, both in terms of instability, in terms of geopolitical risk, in terms of connections. So I just think that, you can try and block it, but, everyone will lose as a result. The sheer economics of it is that is the only way forward. And if we don't do it and everyone else does it, we'll just be at a competitive disadvantage. So I think it would be hard and unsustainable to try and block it, for any length of time.
Yeah, and two things come to mind for me as well, just similar, like, what is that phrase? Think globally, act locally. Like, it's always what I try to do. And when I think of the new administration and the benefits of being in California, and the opportunity we have here as well, but then also more relevant and coming up soon in a couple of weeks, we will see a proposal for whether California, our independent system operator, joins into a Western grid regional Western grid. Is California going to maintain its autonomy under that proposal, or are we going to risk ceding authority to a Trump FERC administration? And that is a big question that we're looking at when that proposal comes, because we don't want Trump getting involved. And also, he said that You know, he's made some ridiculous comments about water recently, infringing on the state's ability to regulate its own water. So could that happen with electricity? Is that door going to be open wider with this regionalization, Western grid regionalization proposal? We don't know, but something to look out for in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Roger. Emmy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Less on like the policy side of things, but I think more on the community side of things. Like I think that like the folks who are most energy burdened are living at the intersection of a lot of different crises. And so I think like what we're just starting to see is like the folks that we're in coalition with are in rapid response mode, just around like immigration and housing and all of these other attacks that are happening. And so, like I think that now is like the time where we lean into mutual aid, where we are supporting one another as a community. And so, like I think that the organizing is going to have to be tiered based off of like the fires that we're putting out. Bad analogy, but also very relevant. And so I think that when we're thinking about organizing around energy, like I think that it's going to have to be intersectional in our approach to really be thinking about the impacts of energy and housing and energy and immigration and all these other components to it.
Great, thank you so much. And we are at time for our Q&A today. So I just wanted to ask if anyone has any final comment to make, any one thing you want to leave with our audience today for a takeaway.
I'm going to go with my movement building one. Keep the dialogue going.
I think I'd like to say, I think that electric vehicles and electrification overall can be a source of resiliency and cost reductions. It's complicated, but they can actually be beneficial rather than a new problem.
I think I would just say that, it really is time. The status quo is non-sustainable and we're losing out. There are so many opportunities here, and now is the time to grab them and to move, because, it's kind of like there's an economist joke that, well, you don't see $100 bills lying on the ground. Well, actually, we do. And it's just up to us to grab it, and we need to change and make these reforms so we can get there.
Mine is that the grid of the future that we all have imagined together is possible. And when it starts from the ground up, that's when the power happens. And so I believe that we can do this.
Thank you so much, everyone. And we also believe that this grid of the future is possible, and we now have a concrete action you can take to help us get there. We have a link to our vision report that we're going to drop in the chat right now. And you can see here, we've got this report that was authored by Jasmine and myself. And we would love for you to click on our social toolkit and share in any way that you feel comfortable with across your platforms. Finally, just want to wrap up here and invite you to our next webinar, which is going to be on Thursday, February 20th. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is part of our Climate Safe California webinar series, and we're always focusing on different topics related to getting to our Climate Safe California vision of removing more pollution than we emit by 2030. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today. If you have further questions, feel free to email any of us at the Climate Center. We can respond to them ourselves or direct them to the appropriate speaker. We're really grateful for your time. And with that, I will wrap things up.